The Rideau Center Gala had been sold out for 3 months. Every table in the grand ballroom of the Chateau Laurier was draped in ivory linen, the chandeliers throwing amber light across faces that had spent considerable money ensuring they looked effortlessly beautiful. Ottawa's most prominent families had gathered under the pretense of charity. The annual Hartwell Foundation dinner, which raised obscene amounts for children's hospitals while simultaneously serving as the city's most ruthless social audition. Nora Keating stood near the far wall with a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched, wearing a burgundy dress her sister had helped her pick out 3 weeks ago, back when tonight was supposed to be different. Back when she was supposed to arrive on the arm of the man who was, at this precise moment, laughing too loudly at something the woman beside him had said. The woman was not Nora. Her name was Priscilla Vance. Everyone in the room knew her, the way everyone in these rooms always knew the women who existed primarily to be known. She was narrow in every direction, with cheekbones that suggested a complicated relationship with food and a laugh that managed to sound both delighted and dismissive at once. She had her hand on Garrison Webb's arm in a way that was not accidental. Garrison had not looked across the room once. Nora was 31 years old, a forensic accountant who had spent the last 4 years unraveling corporate fraud cases that made grown men weep in depositions. She had a mind that worked like a very expensive lock, precise, layered, nearly impossible to crack without the right sequence. She was also, by the standards of the room she currently occupied, unremarkable to look at. She was full-figured in a way that Ottawa's charity circuit did not celebrate. With dark hair she'd spent 45 minutes on and reading glasses she'd left in her clutch because Garrison once said they made her look like someone's aunt. She wished she had them on now. She wished she looked like someone's aunt. She wished she were literally anywhere else. She had met Garrison Webb at a conference 18 months ago, when he'd asked to borrow her pen and then borrowed 45 minutes of her time discussing municipal tax structures, which was, she had thought at the time, a sign of genuine compatibility. She had been wrong about the compatibility. She had been wrong about several things. What she had not anticipated was that he would invite her to the Hartwell Gala, the single most visible social event on Ottawa's calendar, and use her presence as cover while he quietly reintroduced Priscilla Vance into his life. Nora had understood this approximately 7 minutes after arriving, when she'd watched the recognition pass between Garrison and Priscilla like a current, quick and private, and entirely excluding of the woman standing 3 feet away. She should leave. She knew she should leave. But Nora Keating had spent her professional life learning to sit very still in rooms where people wanted her to be invisible, and she was not, on principle, going to give anyone here the satisfaction of watching her go. She was still negotiating this with herself when the room shifted. It was not a dramatic shift. There was no music change, no announcement, but something moved through the crowd the way a change in air pressure moves through a building before a storm. Not seen exactly, but felt. Conversations stuttered, shoulders turned. The particular frequency of the room dropped half a register. Nora followed the ripple to its source. He had come in through the side entrance, which she would later understand was deliberate. He never used the main doors. The main doors were for people who wanted to be seen arriving. He had already arrived in every sense that mattered before he entered any room. His name was Soren Vanek. She didn't know that yet. She would learn it later, piece by piece, the way you learn the dimensions of a room you've been locked inside. What she knew in that first moment was simply the geometry of him. Tall, unhurried, wearing a dark suit with the ease of someone who had never once worried whether he looked correct. He was perhaps 38, with the kind of face that had been assembled for severity, and somehow, against all odds, achieved something more interesting than merely handsome. There was a quality to his stillness that she recognized from courtrooms, the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that the room always came to them. He was accompanied by 2 men who positioned themselves without being told to, the way good chess pieces know their squares. Nora watched him scan the room with the methodical patience of a man taking inventory, and she looked away before his gaze reached her corner. She was not looking at him when he began walking in her direction. She became aware of this gradually, the way you become aware of thunder, first a pressure, then a certainty, then the thing itself standing approximately 4 feet away, looking at her with the focused attention of someone who has already decided something. "You've been counting the exits," he said. She turned. Up close, the severity of his face resolved into something more specific. Grey eyes that processed information at a rate that made her mildly competitive, and a mouth set in a line that suggested he found most conversations inefficient. "I've been counting the tables," she said. 14. 4 chairs each except the round ones near the stage, which seat 6. Seating capacity approximately 80, actual attendance closer to 65. She paused. "The exits are behind you. There are 3. Something moved in his expression, not a smile exactly, something that a smile might one day become under different circumstances. "Soren Vanek," he said. "Nora Keating." He looked at her the way people rarely looked at her in rooms like this, not through her, not past her, not with the polite discomfort of someone cataloguing her as background detail. He looked at her as though she were a document he was finding more complex than the summary had suggested. "You came with Garrison Webb," he said. It was not a question. "I arrived with Garrison Webb," she said. The distinction feels relevant at this point in the evening. The not smile again. "Vanek Group," he said. "Private capital." "I know who you are," she said, because she did now. The name had unlocked, and with it a cascade of information she'd accumulated professionally. Vanek Group. 47 holdings across 6 provinces. The kind of private capital operation that appeared in footnotes and never in headlines, which told you considerably more than any headline could. "I've seen your name in 3 separate forensic audits. You were never the subject. You were always the question no one asked." The stillness that had preceded him through the room seemed to concentrate slightly. "What kind of question?" he said. "The kind that explains everything but isn't in the scope of the assignment," she said, "which means you're either very careful or very clean." She held his gaze. "In my experience, people who are very clean don't require that level of care." For a moment, the ballroom noise around them seemed to recede, the way sound recedes from the epicenter of something. "I want to offer you something," Soren Vanek said. "You've known me for 4 minutes. I've known of you for considerably longer," he said. "Nora Keating, lead forensic accountant, Parrish and Dwyer. You recovered 11 million in concealed assets in the Drummond case. You found a 14-year-old accounting ghost in a Montreal holding structure that 3 other firms missed. You work alone by preference, sleep badly before depositions, and you have been standing against this wall for 40 minutes watching a man demonstrate comprehensively that he doesn't deserve you." The last part landed differently than the rest, not cruelly, not gently. Simply as fact, delivered with the precision of someone who had weighed the cost of saying it and decided the ledger came out in favor. "That's a very thorough introduction," Nora said carefully. "I need a wife," Soren Vanek said. The sentence arrived in the conversation like a stone dropped into still water. Nora watched the ripples and said nothing. "There is a regulatory review," he said, "commencing in 6 weeks, involving 3 of my primary holdings and a federal oversight committee that has been, let's say, selectively motivated. The individual leading the review has made it privately known that he finds my personal circumstances, specifically my lack of them, suggestive of a man with nothing to lose, and therefore nothing moderating his behavior." He paused. "He's wrong about that, but perception is its own kind of leverage. You want a wife to look stable," Nora said. "I want a wife who is genuinely stabilizing," he said. "There's a difference. Anyone can perform stability. What I need is someone who understands the architecture of what I'm protecting and is capable of operating within it without requiring a script. And you chose the woman standing against the wall at a charity gala. I chose the woman who, in 40 minutes of being publicly dismissed, hasn't flinched once, has memorized and just delivered a more accurate read of my professional reputation than my own legal team managed last Tuesday." He paused. "Yes." Toss across the room, Garrison laughed again at something Priscilla said. The sound carried. "What are the terms?" she said. The arrangement was specific. A period of 12 months publicly presented as a genuine relationship and subsequent engagement. She would be introduced into his professional circles, attend necessary functions, and be present, visibly, undeniably present, throughout the regulatory review and its aftermath. In exchange, a fee that made her blink once before she controlled her expression, access to the kind of professional introductions that typically took a decade to accumulate, and his word, which, she would come to understand, was the most precisely maintained instrument in his possession. She asked for 3 days to consider. He gave her 2.5, which turned out to be a form of respect. He had, she would later realize, calculated exactly how long she needed. She said yes on a Tuesday morning, by text with no preamble. His reply was a single address and a time. She had expected his home to be the architectural equivalent of the suit, severe, correct, impersonal. It was not. The house in Rockcliffe Park was large without being punishing about it, and there were books in places that suggested they were actually read rather than acquired for visual effect. There was a dog, a large, indifferent grey wolfhound named something unpronounceable in Czech that she eventually called Cloudy, who assessed her from a doorway and then went back to sleep, which felt like the most honest welcome she'd received in some time. Soren Vanek gave her a tour the way he gave her everything, efficiently, without ceremony, pausing only when he thought something required context, rather than simply observation. He showed her the guest suite she would formally occupy for the sake of household staff, and he showed her separately the office adjacent to his study, where he'd already had a secure workstation installed, because, he said, he assumed she wouldn't stop working simply because her address had changed. She stood in the doorway of that office for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "You had this done before I agreed," she said. "I was reasonably confident," he said. "That's presumptuous. That's accurate," he said. "They're different things." She learned him in fragments, the way you learn a city, one neighborhood at a time, no comprehensive map available, the overall shape only becoming clear once you'd walked enough of it. He rose before 6 without apparent distress. He kept his word with the precision of someone for whom a broken promise represented a kind of structural failure rather than merely a social one. He was not warm in the conventional sense, but he was, and this took her longer to name, genuinely attentive. He noticed things. He remembered them. He adjusted his behavior in small ways that suggested he was updating his understanding of her, continuously, recalibrating the way she did with a complex file. The first public appearance was a private dinner at the house of a federal minister, 14 guests, a table set with the kind of silverware that had opinions about itself. She wore a deep green dress that she'd selected herself, after rejecting Garrison's aesthetic preferences as the irrelevant data they now were. She sat beside Soren and answered questions about herself with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years making herself legible to rooms that had already decided she wasn't worth reading. The difference was that Soren listened to every answer, not performatively, not with the particular attentiveness of someone building a case. He listened the way she had, in her better moments, always wanted to be listened to, as though what she said was the most relevant information in the room. She caught him looking at her, midway through the dessert course, with an expression she could not immediately categorize. It was not the expression of a man executing an arrangement. It was the expression of a man who had said he was going somewhere specific and found himself somewhere else entirely, and was taking stock. She looked away first. She was not sure why. The regulatory review began in April, which also happened to be when Garrison Webb made his first attempt to re-enter her orbit. He called. She didn't answer. He sent a message that described, in considerable detail, how confused he was by her current situation, and how concerned he was for her well-being, the particular species of message sent by people who have done something unkind and are now irritated that the consequences exist. She read it twice, archived it, and forwarded a copy to her personal legal file without quite knowing why. The why became clearer 3 weeks later, when the Oversight Committee's lead reviewer, a federal bureaucrat named Aldous Crane, who had cultivated a reputation for inconclusive investigations that somehow always landed hardest on specific targets, called Soren's legal team to request an informal interview about the regulatory structure of a holdings subsidiary. It was the kind of request that was technically optional and practically mandatory, which was its own form of leverage. What Crane had not accounted for was that the subsidiary in question was one Nora had spent 6 weeks quietly auditing, not because she'd been asked to, but because she had found, in her first week in Soren's house, a 3-year-old financial statement tucked into a file with a minor inconsistency that made her professional instincts surface like a reflex. She had identified the inconsistency, traced it, and discovered it was not Soren's. It was the product of a previous financial officer who had, with considerable creativity, arranged a set of transactions that looked, from certain angles, like something a regulatory inquiry might find interesting. She had documented everything. She had built the case the way she built all her cases, methodically, with the patience of someone who understood that a fact without context is just noise. When Crane's office made its request, Soren's legal team arrived with Nora's analysis. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Crane left with fewer questions than he'd arrived with, and Nora understood from the expression on the face of Soren's lead counsel significantly less appetite for the investigation than he'd previously demonstrated. Soren did not say thank you the way most people said thank you. He said, "How did you know to look there?" And when she told him about the inconsistency in the statement, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I've had 4 financial teams in this house over 3 years. None of them looked there. They weren't looking for problems," she said. "They were looking for the absence of problems. That's not the same thing." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had now catalogued, revisited, and still could not fully interpret. "No," he said, "it isn't. It was mid-May when she found the photograph. She hadn't been looking for anything. She'd been in the library, working at the long table she'd appropriated for sprawling case documents, when Cloudy knocked a stack of folders from the side table and scattered their contents across the floor. Among the papers was a photograph, old enough to be printed rather than digital, slightly curled at the edges, of a woman she didn't recognize standing in front of what appeared to be a lake somewhere north of the city, laughing at something off-camera. She had dark hair and a particular quality of ease that suggested the photograph had been taken before something. She was putting it back when Soren came in. She held it up. She didn't perform casualness about it. That wasn't how they worked. He was quiet for a moment. "Then my mother. She died when I was 19. She looked at the photograph again. She looks like she laughed at things easily." "She did," he said. "It was the thing I found most remarkable about her. She had very little reason to for most of her life. She did it anyway." A pause. "She would have liked you." The sentence landed quietly. "Why?" Nora asked. "She trusted people who were honest about what they saw," he said, "even when it was inconvenient." He paused. "Especially then." They stood in the library with the photograph between them, and the arrangement they had constructed with such architectural precision felt, for a moment, like something that had been there before the paperwork, something that had preceded the terms. She was not prepared for that feeling. She filed it, the way she filed things she wasn't ready to analyze, and she went back to her documents. The gala at the National Arts Center in June was the most visible event of their arrangement, the one both of them understood, without discussing it explicitly, as the test. Ottawa's full social infrastructure would be present. The Oversight Committee's review had concluded inconclusively, which in Crane's vocabulary meant a defeat he wouldn't acknowledge. Soren's name had appeared in a profile piece in a national magazine 3 weeks earlier with language that suggested stability and civic presence, rather than the previous vocabulary of shadow and speculation. Nora wore red. She had not told him she was going to wear red. When she came downstairs, Soren Vanek looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It lasted approximately 2 seconds before he replaced it with his default register of composed attention. But she had seen it. It was the expression of a man who had revised a conclusion he'd been confident in. At the gala, she was introduced as his partner, and the room received this information with the particular quality of attention that famous silences have, a moment of recalibration before the performance of normalcy resumed. She watched people look at her and then look at him, and then look back at her, running the calculation that all these rooms ran, weighing what they saw against what they had expected, finding the numbers didn't resolve into a tidy answer. She found it considerably less distressing than she would have predicted. What she found more significant was Garrison Webb, who was present, and who spent a portion of the evening arriving at the conclusion that he had made an error. She watched this process happen in real time across a distance of approximately 30 feet. The recalibration, the reassessment, the revaluation of something he had previously discounted. He began moving in her direction during the drinks portion of the evening, with the manufactured casualness of someone who has planned an interaction and chosen to pretend otherwise. He managed 4 words, "Nora, you look," before Soren was beside her. Not aggressively, not dramatically, simply present, with a hand resting at the small of her back, with the ease of a man who had done this 10,000 times, which they both knew was not accurate. Looking at Garrison with the patient attention of someone with no particular interest in the outcome of the conversation, but a comprehensive willingness to participate in it. Garrison Webb looked at Soren Vanek for 2 seconds. He looked at Nora for 1. He excused himself and did not return. Later, in the car, she said, "You didn't have to do that." Soren said, "I know." She looked out the window at the Ottawa River lit silver by the June moon. "The 12 months are up in August," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the river. "The review is finished," she said. "The terms are fulfilled." "Yes," he said again. "So I'm saying," she said. And then she stopped because she was not, professionally, accustomed to sentences she couldn't finish. "Nora," he said, and he said her name the way he said things he had considered carefully. Not quickly, not as punctuation, but with the full weight of someone who had held the word for a while and was only now choosing to set it down. He looked at her. "I have spent 11 months believing that I was the one who had constructed something useful, that I'd identified an asset and created a structure around it." A pause. "I was wrong about the architecture." She looked at him. "I don't know the precise word," he said. "I know that when you found the Drummond inconsistency in my files without being asked in your first week. I know that when I watch you sit in rooms that don't deserve you and hold your ground without performing a single moment of it, I know what I feel." He paused. "I know that August is not something I'm willing to participate in." The city moved past them outside, lit and unhurried. Nora Keating had spent her career finding things that had been deliberately hidden, buried in structures designed to conceal them, layered under misdirection and plausible alternatives. She was, perhaps, professionally predisposed to recognize something real when she found it under all that architecture. "The arrangement has a clause," she said, "about renegotiation." Something moved through his expression, not quite a smile, but its immediate predecessor. "I know," he said. "I wrote it." She hadn't known that. She filed that too under things she would need to return to in a room she had more than enough reason to keep coming back to. 3 months later, Garrison Webb's company entered a regulatory review of its own, the kind that did not conclude inconclusively. The investigation was led by a junior analyst from the Federal Oversight Office named Temperance Brouillard, who happened to have trained under one of Nora's former supervisors and had the particular quality of finding inconsistencies that other auditors hadn't known to look for. The review lasted 7 months and cost Garrison Webb the 3 things he valued most: his reputation, his position on the Hartwell Foundation board, and the narrative he had constructed about himself as someone too shrewd to make consequential errors. Nora learned of this by reading the financial filings the way she had always understood the world, through what the numbers said when no one thought they were listening. She set the documents down on the kitchen table of the house in Rockcliffe Park, where the books were read rather than displayed, and the wolfhound judged visitors from doorways, and the man in the study across the hall had once looked at an old photograph and told her she was the kind of person his mother would have trusted. Cloudy padded in from the hallway, assessed her with grey, indifferent eyes, and settled on her feet. Nora looked out at the Rideau River beyond the garden, silver and unhurried in the November light. Some things, she had come to understand, could not be found by looking for them. They had to be found the same way. She had always found the important things by sitting very still in rooms that didn't think you were paying attention and noticing everything anyway.